Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, swagmen and swagettes. I'm your host, Joe Walker, and this is the Jolly Swagman Podcast. Welcome back to the show. We're still riding on a high after finishing Housing Bubble Week. We ended the week at the top of the Australian iTunes business charts. And when I say we, by the way, I mean you and me, because I couldn't do it without your listening, your feedback, and your support. So thank you. It's been especially great continuing the conversation with so many thoughtful people on Twitter. You can find me there at Joseph N. Walker. The main success in Housing Bubble Week doing so well was in bringing the Australian public's attention to a world historic housing bubble and all the unwanted malaise that its unwinding will entail. I ran Housing Bubble Week because I think housing is the most important and interesting story in Australia, yet the most poorly told. Australia is the world's 14th largest economy. We are an important nation, and this bubble will likely bring us to our knees. So I wanted to bring public attention to it. In that sense, we succeeded, and I've been overwhelmed by the response. There is clearly an appetite in Australia for rigorous economic content, free from sputtering hysteria or cloaked agenda, and that's a credit to the intelligence of this audience. This episode represents back to business as usual for the podcast. I'll be taking a break from the housing topic, podcast-wise that is, but only for a while. In the meantime, we'll return to the typical array of in-depth interviews with experts in finance, politics, economics, philosophy, science, and any other areas that take my fancy. By the way, don't forget to hit subscribe to this podcast to keep getting episodes from me when they're released. I'll be putting out about 3 per fortnight. So let's begin this episode. Richard Nixon once said, "I can go into my office and pick up the telephone, and in 25 minutes, 70 million people will be dead." The President of the United States, the person often referred to as the Commander-in-Chief, has a degree of power that would make Alexander the Great, Ceasar, Ghengis Kahn, or Napoleon blush. That individual has unilateral access to the nuclear codes. In about the time it takes to write a tweet, the US president can set loose roughly 900 nuclear weapons, each thousands of times more powerful than Little Boy or Fat Man, and there is nothing anyone could do to stop him. 30 minutes after the launch, everything human civilization has struggled for, fought over, eked out, fashioned, created, and built would be more or less gone. And that's with just a fraction of the roughly 4,000 weapon US nuclear arsenal. The President of the United States is the high priest of the American civil religion, but also the leader of the free world, and not just in a hard, but also a soft power sense. With a nominal GDP of over 20 trillion US dollars per year, constituting the world's largest economy, there is no escaping American influence. So wouldn't it be crazy if the most important person in the most important nation on the planet was a malignant narcissist? In other words, was cut from the same cloth as the worst dictators in history. Wouldn't it be crazy if that person also had hypomanic tendencies? And wouldn't it just be a bad joke if they were now showing clear signs of early stage dementia? This bad joke is being told right now, according to our guest, John Gartner, and we have no idea what the punchline will be. You see, the gravest ex-ante risk in electing Donald Trump president was never about his policies or his demagoguery, it was his mental fitness. It matters not whether you're Democrat or Republican, Coke or Pepsi, this should concern you. But who is John Gartner to say these things? John is a psychologist who maintains clinical practices in Manhattan and Baltimore. He taught in the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University Medical School for 28 years. He graduated from Princeton and received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts. He's the author of 2 books, The Hypomanic Edge and In Search of Bill Clinton. And he's the president and founder of Duty to Warn, an association of mental health professionals and other concerned citizens who advocate Trump's removal under the 25th Amendment on the grounds that he is psychologically unfit. They've collected over 70,000 signatures to their petition. In this episode with John, we discuss exactly what he thinks is wrong with the president's mental state, as well as the plethora of evidence and observations for each of John's diagnoses. And by the way, if you're wondering how John thinks he can diagnose President Trump without even interviewing him in his practice, without sitting him down on the couch, then don't worry, we get into that issue as well. So without much further ado, please enjoy my chat with John Gartner. John Gartner, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We've just met, but we have at least one thing in common, which is that whereas many people want to focus on Trump's policies, his dishonorable conduct, or his demagoguery, by far the most concerning dimension of the Donald seems to be his mental condition or lack thereof. It's really the most pressing and direct way that you could argue that he shouldn't be the president of the United States beyond all of the other deficiencies. And you seem to me to be the most qualified and eloquent person saying this in America. I mentioned to you by email that I first encountered you in this book, which I bought a couple of years ago, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, edited by Bandy Lee, and it has essays from 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assessing the president. Yours was one of those essays. Now, just give us a little bit of context first. Describe your background in relation to this issue of Trump's mental fitness.
Well, it's something I was quite alarmed about even when he was a candidate. I was writing about this. I had an article in the Huffington Post about it, when he was, I think it might have even been 2015, or at least it was, or early 2016. And basically with Donald Trump, we have two major issues having to do with his mental fitness. One, the one that I've been speaking about the most these last couple of years, is this issue of his personality disorder. He suffers from a personality disorder called malignant narcissism, which is different than just narcissistic personality disorder. Malignant narcissism was a diagnosis first introduced by Erich Fromm, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And it was his attempt to explain the psychology of murderous dictators like Hitler, like Stalin, like Mussolini, but also like many later dictators that we've seen today, Milosevic or Erdogan, or I forget who was in charge of Rwanda during the genocide. But we've had a lot of these types of leaders. It's a type. So a lot of people get angry at me when I compare him to Hitler. But the point is not that he's as bad as Hitler. The point is he's part of the same category of people. Some are worse than others. So he might be, if you put it on a scale, he'd be 100 and Trump would be somewhere in the middle. But what they share are four essential elements. One, of course, is narcissism, which we are all well aware of his narcissism at this point. But there's three other components that make it malignant narcissism. One is paranoia. So his crazy conspiracy theories, his crackpot conspiracy theories that would be laughable if they weren't coming from the president of the United States, his constant feeling that he's a victim of some conspiracy himself, his demonization of anyone who disagrees with him, of ethnic minorities, also very common in this type of leader. So there's that paranoid component. Then there's the antisocial component, or what's sometimes referred to as psychopathy. So the psychopath is someone who preys on other people. So he lies, he violates rules and norms and laws, he exploits other people, violates their rights, and he has no remorse about it. So that's really half the people in prison would meet these criteria. So this is a criminal personality disorder. And then the fourth component is sadism, actually enjoying harming or degrading other people. So if you look at his tweets, for example, I actually had to write an introduction to a book where I had to read thousands of his tweets. And what's amazing is 90% of them were denigrating other people, making fun of them, bullying them. So this pleasure that he takes in degrading and harming other people, you put that component together, those four components together, and you have a personality disorder of someone who is truly destructive, truly malignant. And what Erich Fromm told us I don't know if you remember during the election, people were saying, well, once he gets the nomination, he'll pivot to becoming more presidential. And then when he won election, they said he'll pivot to becoming more presidential. And what I said in my article is, no, he'll do the exact opposite. And the reason he'll do the exact opposite is that Eric Fromm warned us that this is what happens, that when these types of personality disorders gain power, they actually get 10 times worse. Now their grandiosity knows no bounds. Now they're paranoid towards anyone who doesn't essentially kiss their ring and love them. And now they are unbound in their ability to do antisocial things, to harm anyone who gets in their way. And so it's like throwing gasoline on a fire to give power to a malignant narcissist. So we knew, those of us in the mental health community who understood this diagnosis, part of the reason we were warning the population, hence our organization Duty to Warn, is because we knew he was going to get dramatically worse once he got in power.
So there's a feedback loop between the power you give a malignant narcissist and their grandiose behavior.
Sure, because it actually confirms their grandiosity, and now they basically gives them a platform from which to. What actually is interesting, what actually happens with these types of leaders is, instead of reality influencing them, they are actually able to change the reality for their society, change the perceptions of the people around them. And here I think Hitler is a great example, because Germany was an anti-Semitic country, sure, but not particularly virulently so, until Hitler took over. And so the idea, killing Jews was not a thing that happened in Germany before the Third Reich. There's a psychologist at Yale named Robert Lifton. He's one of the contributors to the book. He's coined a term malignant reality, in which the malignantly narcissistic leader actually changes reality for the society. So something that is actually aberrant and malignant normality, exactly.
Yeah.
So what it is that what is crazy now becomes normal. So the average person's perceptions start to shift in a disturbed and distorted direction, so that now the final solution makes sense when before that wouldn't have even occurred to anybody. And so that's what's happening with a lot of these Trump supporters. Is people are saying, how can they continue to follow this guy when he's just so obviously lying, so obviously doing bad things, because once they've bought into his worldview, he's now shaping their worldview to make it even more extreme, more paranoid, more aggressive. And so it's a feedback loop, as you said, where the society starts to be influenced by the perceptual distortions of the leader.
I'm going to come back and ask you about malignant narcissism a little later. You mentioned that the people who thought Trump was going to, quote unquote, pivot to being more presidential got it totally wrong. The fact that they got their prediction wrong seems to be predicated on a misdiagnosis of the president himself. It seemed like a lot of these people were saying that this is just a shtick, he's playing to the crowd, he's crazy like a fox. Once he gets office, he'll kind of cast that mask aside. But obviously that's not true when you're dealing with someone who's just simply a malignant narcissist.
Right. And if you look at his life, he's been this way. I mean, he didn't just adopt this persona, when he entered politics. He's been known. I grew up in New York City. People known Donald Trump in New York City as being basically a blackguard, that he's basically been a villainous sort of character.
Yeah.
From the time he was throwing, African Americans out of his housing projects. I mean, in the 70s.
Yeah. Oh God. Well, let me come back.
Look who his friends were. Roy Cohn, his mentor was Roy Cohn, who I don't know if that means anything to people in Australia, but Roy Cohn is sort of known as being the most evil lawyer in history. He was the McCarthy hearing, lawyer, and he was just a famous psychopath. Yeah. Him and Trump and Manafort and Stone actually were all acolytes of this evil.
I was talking to
Roy
someone
Cohn
about that in Sydney the other week. He was saying that, telling me about Roy Cohn, and said, "Did you know this guy was Trump's lawyer?" And if your lawyer is Roy Cohn, then you're in bed with some serious, mafiosos.
Oh, he was very mobbed up, Roy Cohn was. Yeah. And he was more than Trump's lawyer. He was his mentor.
Right.
That's important to realize. Roy Cohn is one that said never, always punch back, always punch back twice as hard. That whole philosophy. He learned that from Roy Cohn, never admit to anything. All this is the wisdom of Roy Cohn, the evil wisdom of Roy Cohn that Trump eagerly adopted at the feet of the master.
Right. I want to come back to the duty to warn. Just tell people what that's about and the story of that.
Well, it happened very organically. I was not a politically active person until this point. And after Trump was elected, I was so alarmed that I actually put a petition online for mental health professionals saying that we thought that he was so mentally unfit that he should be removed under the 25th Amendment. And we very quickly got 70,000 signatures. Not all of them were mental health professionals, but we told the instructions were you should only sign it if you are a mental health professional. Mm-hmm. In truth, a lot of mental health professionals and a lot of non-mental professionals signed it, but we had 70,000 signatures. That became a news item. So that was sort of how we started to get some attention. And then we had a conference at Yale, and then we formed an organization, and we had on October 14th in 2017, we had meetings in 15 cities around the country, with some of them had marches. And so it just became a movement. Yeah. And what's really extraordinary is that book that you held up, that became a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. And what's so extraordinary about that is, well, first of all, I've published a number of books. You live your whole life hoping someday you'll get a bestseller, but only one out of 10,000 books ever becomes a bestseller. So you're very unlikely to have a bestseller. But what's even more unlikely is in my entire adult life, of watching the New York Times bestseller list, not once have I ever seen an edited volume of academic essays make it to the bestsellers list. Ever. Yeah. Never. Not even once. Yeah. Okay. And I think that it wasn't because we wrote the greatest volume in history. I think it's because people were desperate, truly desperate for some insight from the mental health community, that basically hundreds of millions of people were watching their television going, this guy seems crazy to me. Is it me? Or is there something wrong with him? I'm no psychiatrist, but the psychiatrists aren't saying, because of this Goldwater Rule, which I know you'll ask me about later, none of the mental health professionals were coming forward and saying, no, you're not crazy, he is. And so as a result, there was this desperate vacuum that when we stepped forward and said, no, we're willing to take the dive and or fall on the grenade or whatever you say, and tell you what we actually see, tell you what we actually think, give you the evidence that justifies our conclusions that he is disturbed and he is unfit. That's why it just took off like that, because there was such a crying need among the population for some kind of professional validation for what people could see with their own eyes and ears.
I'm just trying to imagine what it would feel like having tens of thousands of mental health professionals sign a petition saying I wasn't mentally fit for my job. But I guess if I was unfit, I probably wouldn't heed their advice.
Well, I don't think we've influenced him at all, but you're right about how extraordinary a historic event that is. Yeah. A lot of people said, oh, you're just a bunch of liberals and you're sorry Hillary lost. And the thing I point out is, look, first of all, probably most mental health professionals probably are more on the liberal end of the spectrum, but never in history have they mounted a movement to declare a candidate to be mentally unfit. It's not that, and we've certainly had lots of conservative people who have run for office. I didn't like George Bush's policies. I didn't think he was mentally unfit. I thought he had some ADD and whatever, but I didn't think that he was mentally unfit. And the other thing I point out to people, it's not like if we remove Donald Trump, we get Hillary Clinton for president. We'd get Pence, who's even more conservative. So it's not about policy, and it's about psychopathology.
Yeah. And in a way, it's ultimately about the nuclear codes, isn't it?
Well, it is, and this is the ultimate nightmare, is that this guy has the unilateral power to start nuclear war just because he feels like it on any given day.
Now,
and this
you know that legally? He has the unilateral power?
I do know that legally, and there's a reason for it. The reason for it is during the Cold War, The concern was that if the Russians pushed the button, we had about a minute and a half to respond before they would wipe out all of our missiles. And so in order to be ready to defend ourselves, we put the nuclear codes in the hands of the president. He literally punches in, whatever it is, 9, 12 numbers, and the missiles are launched and nothing can stop them. There's no second key. There's no process. He literally punches in the numbers and they launch. There actually was a law in Congress that we were lobbying for. Ted Lieu submitted it, that actually, if it's a first nuclear strike, Congress should be required to authorize it. That law did not pass, but that law made sense because we've passed the era where we need an instantaneous response. It's more important that we don't have a impulsive response or a mistaken response because the results could be so catastrophic. Now we throw in another component of Trump's disorder that makes him even more dangerous with the nuclear codes, which is I believe that he's showing signs of developing dementia.
We'll come back to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but just to think of it, so we have someone who has got the basic moral and martial impulses of a dictator, but whose mind is also deteriorating cognitively. So think about a perfect storm. You really couldn't get a more dangerous situation than that.
Yeah. God. I wonder if he's ever asked someone or a staffer where the codes are, just for future reference, and what their reaction was. Like, hey, where do you keep that button?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, there is somebody with a suitcase who must be with him at all times. So there were actually pictures of Mar-a-Lago with the guy with the suitcase sitting like at a table next to him. So it's always there.
God,
it's always present.
What a way to stroke a malignant narcissist's ego. Having a guy follow you around with giving you the option to destroy the world at any one moment.
And by the way, that's a very good point because he has no concern for any human being other than himself, and because he's fundamentally a corrupt and evil person. If he feels threatened, if his sense of power and dominance is challenged, this could be a way for him to strike back and feel powerful again. So this is one of my concerns, is that it might right the psychological balance for him. He'll show them. You laughed at me, I'll show you. So he's someone who's capable of that kind of primitive logic.
God. So you mentioned the Goldwater Rule, and many people might be thinking, John and all these other experts haven't actually sat Trump down on the couch
right
in their practice and interviewed him. Why is that? What is the Goldwater Rule, and why is an in-person interview, why doesn't it apply in this circumstance? Yeah, no,
it's a good question. Well, it's important for people maybe just to take a step back and a little history lesson as to because the Goldwater Rule was very obscure. No one ever heard of it until Trump, if you weren't in the field. And the history of it is actually interesting. In 1964, Barry Goldwater ran for president, and a magazine that's now defunct called Fact Magazine did a survey of psychiatrists, and they argued that psychiatrists say that Goldwater is unstable. And actually, it was one of the things that Lyndon Johnson used to win the election, because they had this famous daisy ad where they, had a girl picking the leaves off a daisy, and then in the last one she says, I guess he not, he loves me, not, and then they do the 10, 9, 8, 7 countdown of the missiles, and they're saying Goldwater, we can't take a chance, this idea that he was unstable. Well, the truth is actually Goldwater was not unstable, so it actually was libelous. And he sued, and he actually won $75,000, and it embarrassed the field. And one of the things that was fallacious about these assumptions was this is the era when Freudian psychiatry kind of ruled the roost in our field. So the psychiatrists were making these kind of wild speculations. They were saying things like he was a latent homosexual, or he's been scarred by his potty training, or he had an unresolved Oedipus complex. These are actually direct quotes. And these really were irresponsible speculations. I actually spoke to the last living member of the committee that formed that Goldwater Rule, and that's what they were reacting to. He said, we never intended it to be a gag order that no one could ever make a statement about a public figure. We just didn't want them making irresponsible statements. Well, in 1980, our profession took a very dramatic change, which is that we adopted the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, now up to the 5th edition. What made the DSM special was that it imposed observable behavioral criteria for every disorder that we diagnose. So that, in other words, it's not about a theory or a speculation about someone's potty training. It's about, can I observe him performing these behaviors or these behaviors or these behaviors? So, for example, with antisocial personality disorder, the very, very serious criminal personality disorder, which is only one of his personality disorders, the first criteria is frequent lying. Mm-hmm. Well, he's now past the banner margin of having now told his 10,000th lie. According to the Washington Post, as president.
Yeah.
Okay, I would submit to you that this is a Guinness Book of World Record, record lying, that he is the most documented liar in human history.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can check that box. Okay. A pattern of violating norms and laws. Well, one of the things about his presidency is all he does is violate norms. That's part of how he's destroying our Constitution, because he's not behaving like a president. 90% of what a president does isn't about the law, it's about the norms. But he also has violated laws. He's the unindicted co-conspirator in the Cohen case. And, of course, he did commit obstruction of justice. And I believe he also committed collusion with Russia. But, he's committing crimes every day. He committed crimes before he came into office. That's why he doesn't want his financial records exposed. So check. Exploiting other people, well, that's what he does. Trump University, not paying his workers, that's exploiting people. Violating the rights of others, well, he's been accused of multiple sexual assaults. Is that violating the rights of others? In other words, this is not a subtle call. This is not a judgment call. This is a gross, broadside of the barn, obvious diagnosis. And my sitting down with Donald Trump would not, and having him lie to me and jawbone me for, half an hour or an hour, would not add anything to the validity of my diagnosis. The question is, has he performed these behaviors? Well, we know from our observation of his public behavior, his statements on Twitter, and also significant others who have been in the Trump administration, who have worked up close with him, that they have all validated that he, in fact, is even worse than it appears in all of these regards. So we have more evidence. I know more about Donald Trump's psychopathology probably than all my patients put together, because I don't follow them around and observe their behavior all day. I don't read their social media feed. I don't talk to significant others who have worked with them for years and get the scuttlebutt from the third party. So there's no question about the validity of our capacity to make a diagnosis from a distance. It's really been this historical pattern. And then we have the American Psychiatric Association, which is hardly a profile in courage, that from their point of view, there's nothing to be gained, right, by antagonizing the president or any other political figure. In fact, they had a whole meeting about the Goldwater Rule, sort of a crisis response to the election, and they doubled down on it. They said, not only can't you diagnose, you can't even make a statement about a public figure. But behind the scenes, the president of the APA said, look, one of the reasons we have to do this is we don't want Trump to cut our third-party payments. And later he claimed he was joking when he said that. But the person who heard it didn't think he was joking, who reported it to me. And he reported it to the New Yorker, so it's in print. But the point is, right, the main job of the American Psychiatric Association is not to protect the public. The main job of the American Psychiatric Association is to protect the psychiatric profession. They're a guild. They're a guild. And so the point is that why do anything that's going to cause them to get into trouble or create controversy or make people against them? They already feel like they're suspect. People think they're pseudoscience. So this is really about a very, I think, selfish and corrupt decision that the American Psychiatric Association has made. And I'm going to be giving grand rounds on this at a medical school later. And after I give my whole speech, usually the audience has questions for the speaker, but I'm going to start the question and answer by saying, I have a question for you, the audience. If you had to hazard a guess, who do you think history will treat more kindly? Those who spoke up or those who were silent in the Trump era? Or even worse, those who tried to silence others by enforcing the Goldwater Rule? To whom will history be kinder?
I think that's a great point, and it connects to another thought I had, a little broader, which is that, in a sense, the Trump's enablers are more morally reprehensible than Trump himself, because there's a sense in which his behavior is already determined by these very grievous psychological disorders, but the enablers have more sort of moral culpability because they're many of them, I assume, are not burdened by similar pathologies and like should be in a position to demonstrate more discernment and judgment and courage.
Yeah. This is really what happens with these dictatorial regimes. It's Plato predicted that democracies would always self-combust and digress into or devolve into dictatorships. And one of the ways that this happens is through purges. Stalin did this, Saddam Hussein did this, Hitler did this, which is that the people the advisors who have some integrity and some expertise, they get fired or they quit or they're executed, okay, until you finally sort of purify the leadership to the point where you have pure psychopaths or pure fanatical true believers or hangers-on and opportunists. In other words, people who are going to not say no to the dictator, not sort of hew to reality and morality, but people who are going to enable the dictator. And so that's why, one of the other false reassurances that people gave when he became president is, okay, he's a crazy, but he's got a lot of good people around him.
So
and those people were...
There's like a selection bias towards the sycophants.
Exactly. And those people will kind of keep him in line. Well, it's true, and Bob Corker, famously said that the White House was an adult daycare facility. Well, the problem is all the adult daycare workers are gone. Tillerson is gone. Mattis is gone. Kelly is gone. Not that these were such great people to begin with, but they did say no to him sometimes. They did restrain him sometimes. They did sort of block some of his most grievous and ill-informed impulses. But what happens is those people get extruded. And so now you have the true sycophants. You have the Mick Mulvaney's and the McCarthy's and the Lindsey Grahams and the Bill Barrs. The people who will say anything, do anything to protect this president. Morality, reality aren't even considerations.
Yeah. I want to come back to wrap up the question of the Goldwater Rule. So all that matters for a diagnosis under the DSM-5 is observations, and you're saying it's sort of arbitrary to say that those observations have to occur while the person's sitting on your couch in front of you. If you have a plethora of evidence from other contexts, like
exactly
them on a stage.
In fact, actually, research shows the personal interview is the least reliable method of diagnosis because people can lie to you and manipulate you. So you're actually more likely to have an accurate diagnosis. If you had to pick one source of information, observing someone's behavior or hearing from significant others, you're more likely to be accurate than just hearing from the patient's point of view, their distorted, or in Trump's case, just crazy or lying point of view.
Got it. And moreover, this is still in the spirit, if not the letter, of the Goldwater Rule itself.
Yes, because because the original Goldwater Rule was saying there shouldn't be irresponsible statements. And these are very well validated, very easily justifiable statements. And that's why he keeps fitting the pattern that we keep describing, because we're right.
So I want to briefly come back to malignant narcissism now, because you almost described a recipe for a true monster before. Yes. When you mentioned the four components: narcissism, yes, antisocial personality disorder, paranoia, and sadism. I just want to hop around a couple of these now, sort of like lily pads, and touch on a few more questions. Antisocial personality disorder. As our resident expert, can you tell us what that means and the difference between that and sociopathy, psychopathy, in definition?
No, they're equivalent. They're synonyms.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Now, the most egregious of those four legs seems to be the sadism, because that's literally taking pleasure in the pain of other human beings.
Yes.
That would be an extraordinary claim. What sort of extraordinary evidence do we have for Trump's sadism?
Well, I think the most poignant one is the zero tolerance policy, the child separation policy, that they came up with this brainchild, right, that no one had ever thought of anything so devious or dastardly before, that when people come to our borders asking for asylum, not only are we going to arrest them, when they in fact are entitled to apply for asylum, they have the legal right to apply for asylum. We can not give it to them and send them back, but we actually don't have the right to incarcerate them. But we're going to incarcerate them, and we're going to take away their children and incarcerate their children. I mean, this is monstrous. This is like Sophie's Choice kind of stuff. First of all, what he did is he created all of these, and they are concentration camps in the desert for migrants. And the definition of a concentration camp is not a death camp. I understand we're not talking about Auschwitz here. But a concentration camp is a camp meant to concentrate an undesirable element of the population in a segregated space. And so he built out, him and Stephen Miller had a plan to incarcerate 300,000 or 400,000 of these people and separate them from the children, keep them all in camps. And, you heard that audio of the kids crying for their mothers, and it was so moving. I don't know if you heard that audio. It made a lot of waves here when people actually heard the kids crying. What I'm saying is that's music to his ears. He loved the sadism of pulling these children away from their parents. It was like an added bonus for him. And they managed to lose all of the kids' records. They didn't even try to keep track of which kids went with which parents. So then they couldn't even reunite them. There's still thousands of kids who have not been reunited with their parents because no one even bothered to keep track of which kid went with which adult. So that's an example of sadism. Who would torture children, right? And see this as like a good idea, a good policy. It's almost like adding an element of sadism to something that you could just say, we don't want to let people in. But no, let's take their children away and never give them back.
Mm. Now, paranoia, to what extent, say Trump's talking about, drug dealers and rapists coming over the southern border. Or, Mueller out to get him. Or Obama tapping his phone.
Right.
To what extent are these, again, just the shtick, and it's him trying to whip up his base, kind of playing a role? And to what extent could we say that those are examples of genuine paranoia? Maybe I'm sure there are other examples as well.
There are hundreds of examples.
Yeah.
In fact, at one point I was trying to keep track of them, and it was kind of like, oh, wait, remember that crazy idea from 3 months ago? Oh, yeah, I forgot all about that one, because every day there's 5 new ones.
It's the malignant normality.
Right. Yeah. We've just become accustomed to it, right? We've just become, that's just normal. Sometimes with him, it is a little unclear when he is being crazy and when he's just lying. When is he lying to others to just deceive them or manipulate them? And when is he actually lying to himself or actually experiencing a distortion of reality? I think at any given point, it's not always clear, because I think he does both, but he does do both. He does actually believe a large number of these crazy things that he says, and others he just uses for effect to whip up his base. I think it's both. Okay.
Now, malignant narcissism, you mentioned Hitler as an historical example. Erich Fromm diagnosed Hitler. Are we sure Hitler was a malignant narcissist?
Well, if he wasn't, then I don't know who was.
Okay. So again, we've got all of those observations, biographical details. We can build a pretty good picture.
Exactly. And he was essentially the original model. I mean, when Erich Fromm fled Nazi Germany, that's who he had in mind.
And other famous historical examples, you mentioned some of the other dictators. I think people have raised Julius Caesar as a candidate.
I don't know enough about Caesar's biography, so I'm coming up a little short historically there. But the kind of modern dictators that we know more about, if you're not a student of ancient history, there's plenty of examples. It's not that uncommon a type to take control of society.
Yeah. Now, of which of the 4 legs, the narcissism, antisocial personality disorder, paranoia, and sadism, do you feel has the least satisfactory supporting evidence in the case of Donald Trump?
They all have a surplus of evidence.
Okay.
I have complete confidence in all 4.
Great.
And I think we should talk about his cognitive decline as well, because I think that's a whole other component to what makes him unfit and dangerous. I know you had said before we went on air that you noticed some traits in him that you'd seen in a relative that had dementia. I've had a lot of people say that to me. Now, when we first raised this issue about his potentially having dementia, that was a year ago, actually. And I don't know if you remember this, but Ronnie Jackson, his physician, gave him an exam.
So this was the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test.
Exactly. And we had actually, before that exam, a group of us, about 75 doctors, wrote a letter to Ronnie Jackson requesting that he give that exam or one like it. And that letter got a bunch of attention. I'm not sure if that's the reason he gave it. I'm not saying that it's because of us, but we had requested that he do that, and he did do it. And that, of course, then Trump, just like now he's totally been vindicated by the Mueller report, which, of course, he hasn't. But he claimed that, his passing this cognitive screening meant not only that he didn't have dementia, but that showed that he was a genius and smarter than all previous presidents. Well, you have to understand what's on the Montreal test. It's, can you repeat 3 numbers backwards? Can you recognize a camel and an elephant? Can you draw a clock? Okay, this doesn't mean that he's smarter than Barack Obama. I think Barack Obama could do all those things. But what it does mean is you're not grossly demented. It doesn't mean that you're not in the process of becoming demented. So that was the issue we raised, is that, yes, he passed the MOCA, but the reason we had asked them to give the test is because what we noticed, and this is a very reliable sign of organic cognitive decline, is that his verbal productions had dramatically deteriorated from his own baseline. If you look at interviews that he gave in the 80s and 90s, he was actually quite articulate. He was still a jerk, but he was still articulate. He spoke in polished paragraphs. He had a larger vocabulary. And now his vocabulary is substantially diminished. His thoughts are much more fragmented. He has trouble finishing a sentence without derailing into an irrelevancy, without much less being able to speak in polished paragraphs. So that was the thing.
Sorry, just let me push back on that briefly, because I read an article in the New York Times by the New York University linguist John McWhorter about a year ago, and he was trying to pass Trump's speaking style, and he said that, don't be too worried, it's just a conversational style. And I'll just read out the quote that he finished the article with. The difference between the younger man talking in sentences and the older one talking in vocal ejaculations is evidence not of decline, but authenticity. He has settled into his normal. Late in life, an artless man has learned that he could leave his linguistic fly unzipped and life would go on. It may not be pretty, but it isn't a sign that his pants are going to fall down, end quote. So McWhorter's just saying that, like, it's almost like the ultimate alpha male move. I'm a billionaire, I'm president. I don't give a fuck about anyone to the extent where I'm just going to say whatever I want.
Right. And I've heard that argument. And another way to put it is, maybe he's kind of dumbing down his speech to appeal to his base of poorly educated people. And a lot of politicians do that. I mean, Bill Clinton was actually a genius. People don't realize how his intellect was off the scale, but he talked in a folksy Arkansas kind of manner. The thing is, since that time, in the last year, we've noticed even further deterioration, which isn't simply a matter of being more folksy. It's things like, when he was talking about the Mueller investigation, he said, we're going to have to look at the oranges of the investigation, where it came from, the oranges of the investigation. He meant origins. Okay. And this is something called a paraphasia, where you actually use the wrong word. He used it 3 times, said oranges very clearly. Okay. That's not a folksy speaking style. That's really a serious, troubling sign. The other kind of paraphasia is where people actually say things that are not English words. They just have some of the same syllables of the words they're trying to say. So, for example, when he was introducing Benjamin Netanyahu, he called him Betanyahu. That he said peninsula instead of peninsula. There's about, if you go online, actually the Daily Show put about 30 of these together, where he really uses words that are not words. They're not actual words. They're sounds that are similar to the words he's trying to say. And that kind of paraphasia is something we normally only see in someone that has a fairly advanced dementia. They have to be at least in the intermediate stage. And finally, his memory is such that, I don't know if this incident made it across the water, but at one point he was talking about, in an interview, how his father was born in Germany.
Yeah, he said it twice.
Right? He said it twice. I think he said it 3 times, actually.
Right.
And his grandfather was born in Germany, not his father. His father was born in the Bronx. And my uncle, who recently died of Alzheimer's, right before he went into the nursing home, he became agitated at one point, and he cried out for me. He said, "Somebody call John. He's a rich lawyer. He'll know what to do." Well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a psychologist, but my father was a lawyer. He wasn't rich, by the way, but but he was a lawyer. So what my Uncle Bruce was doing was he was combining me and my father into one person. And that's what Donald Trump was doing. He was combining his father and his grandfather into one person. So now we're not talking about just forgetting people's names, calling Tim Cook Tim Apple. We're talking about actually confusing your father and your grandfather. This is really serious. This is not just cognitive decline. These are actual clinical signs of dementia. So it's gotten worse. It's not a folksy speaking style. He's speaking words that are not English. That just sound like the words he's trying to say, or confusing his father and his grandfather, or using the wrong word like orange instead of origin. These are now we've really gone, as we predicted, that if this were an organic cognitive decline, we said a year ago, then a year later he'll look worse. And now it's a year later and he looks worse. And we're looking at more serious clinical signs.
Right. And is this likely to accelerate or maintain at a steady rate for a few more years?
Well, he's going to keep going downhill. There's only one way that gravity goes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an experimenter, a research psychologist in Pittsburgh who actually looked at the grade level of his, his speech, and it's like he's kind of losing half a grade every year. So it's like he's gone from being like 8th grade to 5th grade. So, is he going to be in kindergarten by the time he finishes office? I mean, we are watching a deteriorating function. And it's only going to get more obvious. But because we live in this crazy polarized society, it's like the emperor's new clothes. Here he is showing not only blatant psychopathology, but blatant cognitive deterioration. And we're all kind of pretending that he spoke English words, even though he spoke nonsense syllables.
Do we have any historical analogues of figures who've combined both the malignant narcissism and the dementia?
Not to my knowledge. That's not to say there haven't been any. I mean, I was joking with you earlier about the madness of King George. There have been some some rulers that had syphilis or whatever, that kind of gradually went mad from organic reasons that may have had some personality disorder to begin with, and the combination makes them obviously extremely dysfunctional. But really in the modern era, I cannot think of a leader that we've known that combined the cognitive deterioration with the malignant narcissistic personality disorder. So we are really dealing with a perfect storm of the absolute worst case scenario. Now,
you mentioned malignant normality, where the malignant narcissist dictator starts to warp the surrounding social mores.
Yeah.
That's interesting, but I want to know, does that connect to any existing psychological or sociological literature about human groups?
Well, there is literature on it. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, for example, if you look at the in Rwanda, the genocide there, that was actually a top-down genocide. It was the government that started broadcasting on the radio that people should start, that the Tutsis were a danger to society and you have to cleanse them. In other words, when the leader is immoral, and gives orders that this is what you need to do, it incites the population. One of the things that we see here in America is that hate crimes have gone up dramatically since Donald Trump was elected president. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. When he says there are good people on both sides, talking about Charlottesville, where the Nazis were marching in this University of Virginia town, and some people were protesting against them, and he made it sound like they were morally equivalent. That's sending a message. This whole white supremacy thing and attacks on minorities, after the election, I knew about 20 different people that saw swastikas just showing up at the synagogue or on the mailbox or in the schoolyard. There were no swastikas before. Suddenly there were swastikas. This all happened after Election Day.
So we have malignant narcissism, we have pre-dementia, but there's a third and final sort of cherry on top. Just tell us what that is, John.
Well, I mean, those two are bad enough. I also think he has a hypomanic temperament. which is something I've written about in my previous works, which isn't always a bad thing. But these are people who have a lot of energy, who are very impulsive, very grandiose, very irritable. They don't sleep very much. They make impulsive decisions. Sometimes they can be very visionary. But the problem is when you have someone whose fundamental character is destructive, then you don't want them making impulsive, off the cuff kind of decisions. And actually,
tweets or things
and
like
his
that.
3 a.m. tweets. I think the 3 a.m. tweets is really kind of in some way says it all. Like, why are you up at 3 a.m. and why are you spewing all this bile and all this craziness at 3 a.m. when you should be sleeping and resting so you can be competent to be president the next day?
Now, you have two books on that related to that topic. One is that I think about Bill Clinton, that he was hypomanic.
Yes, right. That was my thesis, that Bill Clinton was hypomanic.
Another fantastic book about entrepreneurs.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah,
Well,
it's amazing how many entrepreneurs contact me saying they identify with that book. It's an example where that temperament can be positive. It can be directed but even those people have issues. The people who work with them can find them impossible and hard to contain and hard to reason with. Venture capitalists will tell you about half the time they end up firing the founders of the companies they invest in because they're so difficult to work with, even though they're the visionary that came up with the idea in the first place and brought it to reality. So these are difficult characters. But when you combine it with someone whose fundamental personality is so warped, then it's a vector of force that's being exerted in a destructive direction.
Yeah. I'm curious, what's your personal motivation here? I mean, obviously you're speaking up very courageously. I find everything you say entirely convincing. Why aren't more people saying it, and why are you saying it so loudly?
Well, I think a lot of people are saying it. If you follow, George Conway on Twitter, was talking about how Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist. He was adopting our, diagnosis. And there were millions of tweets that came through about this, literally. I think the general population who aren't in his 37%, right, who didn't drink the Kool-Aid, who aren't part of his cult, I think they all see it. I don't think it's so blatant. You really don't have to be a mental health professional to see that there's something very, very wrong here. It's just that we saw it early and we felt a need to warn the population that they were in danger because of this person's disorder, that people were making these positive assumptions. It's an act. He'll pivot. He'll have people around him. And we knew those things wouldn't be true. We knew that, in fact, that this was a dangerous and deteriorating person who was going to put not just the country at risk, the world at risk, and our way of life at risk, our Constitution at risk, our national security at risk. This is, I just can't imagine anything more extraordinarily dangerous for more people than the presidency of Donald Trump.
I couldn't agree with you more. And finally, John, why can't we invoke the 25th Amendment? And given that, what's the likely course of events, in your opinion, for the remainder of the Trump presidency?
Right. Well, if the Republican Party weren't corrupt to its core, we could invoke the 25th Amendment. In fact, we know from some of these tell-all books that among the White House staff, hashtag 25 was an inside joke. They used to text each other when he would do something nutty, and they, oh boy, another 25th Amendment. And famously, Rod Rosenstein was questioning whether the cabinet he should invoke the 25th Amendment. But he actually went to some members of the cabinet and said, you should invoke the 25th Amendment. This guy's out of control. Of course, Rod Rosenstein, no profile in courage himself, has now become a Trump toady also. But this is what happens in the corrupting vortex of Donald Trump.
What's the process?
His initial instincts.
What's the process to invoke the 25th?
So the process is that the majority of the cabinet and the vice president have to say, look, he's not fit. And they vote and he's removed from office temporarily. He can protest it. And then, according to the Constitution, there needs to be a body that can evaluate him. One of the people that I've worked with is a Congressman, Jamie Raskin, who was actually a constitutional lawyer, who's saying, we never set up that body. It's in the Constitution. Maybe we should set up that body. And so he had a law that he was trying to pass, House Resolution 1986, that would actually set up that body. But because, of course, of the thorough corruption, that even though they themselves know and speak among themselves that the 25th Amendment would, in fact, be appropriate, they will never invoke it. So then the next stop would be impeachment, which I'm very frustrated with our Democratic congressmen that they're not aggressively pursuing impeachment. But I think at some point they probably will have to, because now he's trying to marginalize Congress. So in addition to all his other crimes, he's also obstructing Congress, so not allowing them to do their investigations into his wrongdoing. But the truth is he'll never be convicted in the Republican Senate either. So in reality, probably our best hope is just to defeat him in the 2020 election. But in the meantime, to expose him so that people will be informed when they go to the voting booth just what they're choosing between. And there, the congressional investigations hopefully will help inform the public as to how dangerous and criminal a person he is. But unfortunately, so much of our system has broken down around Donald Trump. It's really shocking, to see that the Constitution is kind of crumbling under the force of this one madman and his corrupt enablers. And I hope we can get it back on track, but it is not a sure thing. Plato may end up being right, and we may end up, the city on a hill, this shining beacon of democracy that we've always imagined ourselves to be, we may go the way of other democracies that have turned into autocracies.
John Gartner, on that optimistic note, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Great to speak with you. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Before you go, could I ask a quick favour? If you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast on iTunes, could you please do so? I know everyone asks, but it helps. It really does. Making these podcast episodes is bloody time consuming, but they're important and I couldn't do them without you. Also, if you want to keep getting episodes as they come out, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. That's all. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you. Until next time, ciao.